Welcome to the 80s, the new heresy hunting, and the trial of Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. I'm Zev Elef. I am Associate Professor of Jewish History at Torah College and Provost, Chief Academic Officer of Hebrew Theological College in Skokie, Illinois. I am joined by two remarkable scholars and leaders. First, in alphabetical order, is Rabbi Seth Farber, the founder and director of EP10. He is also a scholar of American Jewish history. His very, very important book on the history of the Maimonides school and Rabbi Soloveitchik, an American Orthodox dreamer. And Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who so many founders and leaders of, certainly Klal, and that will come up later on, I suspect, but also directed and was the chair of the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I don't have enough hands to hold up the number of articles and several important books, but one item that certainly will is garnering attention in the academic and lay circles, but will come up, is the recent work edited by Adam Ferziger, Miri Freund-Kandel, and Steve Bain. And maybe a word about how we came to this. Seth and I have a forthcoming article on the history of heresy in American Judaism, particularly in the 1980s. The article is going to come out in Religion and American Culture, we hope quite soon. And in that research, what we figured out is that, or what we suggest, is that there came to be a production of a new discourse around heresy in the 1980s, and heresy I put in quotation marks. We don't mean to level and to levy judgment here, but really to understand what's happening at a particular moment in American Jewish history, particularly within Orthodox Judaism. And we're going to review and rehearse some of those items and really try to tease out, which is that there became a culture of anti-modernism in the last decades of the 20th century, and they manifested as new archetypes of heresy hunting. And when they were fashioned, they produced a new language, which gave tradition-bound faiths, in our case, Orthodox Judaism, a new taxonomy, a new language to create borderlines. We'll review some of that, but then we'll give certainly ample attention, and I so much thank Yitz for offering not only his archives to Harvard University, which help address this episode, but the willingness to talk about a moment in time which was challenging and was difficult, certainly for everyone involved, and most challenging of all to Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. So that'll be our agenda for me this early afternoon. For my fellow panelists, very late at night in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel. And without further ado, so the first slide, Mordechai Kaplan and a prehistory of Orthodox heresy hunting, I think really does help us. And Seth, maybe you can really help parse this out, but shows just how a discourse of heresy is manufactured a moment in time. So here you have three images. The first is from the American Hebrew in 1904, which isn't attacking Kaplan per se, but every graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary, not because, as one might have expected, biblical criticism or Torah mina shamayim, or not to say that they believed it or didn't believe it, but not using the typical taxonomy produced by the Maimonidean principles of faith. And of course, Mark Shapiro has written about the reception history of the Maimonidean principles of faith. But if they were at one point in time, and still are, in many circles, a canon of what is in and what is out of a faith community. This article has nothing of it. And in fact, what is the charge? The charge is that one, not from the American Hebrew, but the Agudas HaRabbanim, which was founded 2 years prior. It's actually founded on the same afternoon that the New York Jewish community buried the first chief rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef. That's when those the attendees of that funeral decided to form the Agudas HaRabbanim of the United States and Canada. And 2 years later, they come out with a papal bull, essentially, that anyone who delivers a sermon in English, so basically anybody not in Israel, is a blasphemer, is not to be trusted, no longer has the bona fides of orthodoxy. And similarly, and I'll open it up right after this, is a sermon that just came into my hands only about a year ago, is in 1920, just before he was to resign as the founding rabbi of the Jewish Center in Manhattan. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan addresses allegations that were published in the Hebrew Standard, a very important traditional wielding newspaper in Manhattan at the time. And he writes, as I say, I want to disabuse your minds, where he was championing that he was an Orthodox rabbi. Certainly after he would say, you know what, I'm not. But for the time, he writes, as I say, I want to disabuse your minds of the impression that I have come with a new revelation and that I am advocating anything that is contrary to historical or traditional Judaism. I'm not a heretic. I want to make clear to you that historical traditional Judaism, Judaism in its continuity, is what I stand for and what I work for. And I'm not suggesting that everybody that's going to be discussed in this presentation is a Kaplan. I'm only looking at what is the charge of heresy. If in the interpretation of it, I have said something that was different from what the hearer expected, the fact of the matter is that the hearer drew a conclusion that I am not advocating traditional or historical Judaism. We have become so used to a certain type of preaching. It's the language itself. It's the intonation of Kaplan's preaching, his use of social science, of modern humanities research, to a certain set of ideas or arguments advanced to prove the correctness of traditional or historical Judaism, that if we hear another kind of argument, another kind of defense, we draw the conclusion that the man, in this case it was usually the man, who is advancing this other kind of argument or defense is not advocating, historical Judaism. Now Kaplan himself would self-remove from Orthodox Judaism, but here we have two, I think, really excellent, very cogent sources, which suggest that there's more to heresy than the 13 principles of faith, than anything that would be found in a traditional rabbinic source.
Here we're really talking at a time in American Judaism where you can't even use the phrase American Orthodoxy. What you're really talking about is a transplanted Orthodoxy, and Yaakov Yosef's arrival in America is the best example of that, where there's an enormous dissonance between the European rabbis who are coming over and assuming that the Judaism that they saw in Europe is really the one they're going to find in America. Right? The old joke about Yaakov Yosef is that it all was going very well and he was going to be the chief rabbi of America and all the expectations were great until he opened his mouth the first time. And as soon as that happened, everything fell apart. When there's certain expectations made and American or Orthodox Jews are trying to kind of set their path forward about what they are, they're trying to define things. And in fact, the great irony of this, of the passages you read, is that they're passages we could read in Europe also, 50, 60 years before, or even 30 years before. They're exactly the same things. Some of the issues about preaching in Yiddish as opposed to German are pretty much the same things we saw in Europe. This is a good example of the transplanted. And you don't get to American Orthodoxy having an identity yet, which we'll find out later on that actually forms an identity or forges an identity. in the 60s and 70s after the great threat of disappearance passes. So they have the numbers at this point, or it's almost all Jews are observant that are living in America at this point, or that slowly that number will go up. But the issues are basically the same issues. There's no identity yet. The identity will only come later.
And Yitz, what do you make of language being a determinant, an essential factor in the language of who's in and who's out? Not is it fair or not, but in your experience, and we're going to get to one particular experience, but in your experience as an observer, as a leader within American Judaism, I guess if you're in Israel, we should say global Judaism. What type of currency does language have?
I see something else here. Orthodoxy, and certainly certain versions of it, is just simply traditional thinking. What is familiar, what is the same. So any change, language, of course, is an exceptionally visible example. Any change from what they used to is considered off the derech. So, in effect, in this case, what they were saying was that Yiddish is the only legitimate language of a traditional Jew, and of course, that's one reason why Orthodoxy, in fact, suffered very heavy losses in the 40s and 50s, because the average American Jew said, well, if you're Yiddish, you're European, you're greener, you're immigrant. So the answer again is, if you focus not on the substantive, but on the familiar, and if you are, as a traditional Jew, it means that you don't want to see any change at all, then yes, not only language, the length of the jacket, one could go on, becomes a mark of a heresy.
Right, and one of my teachers, Jeff Gurak, he counted the numbers, and so many of the JTS ordinees in the pre-World War II period were yeshiva college graduates. And part of it was job placement. It was the ability to earn a living, to earn a keep, whether it's the jacket, whether it's the material, whether it's the language. So much of faith is bound up in presentation, is the nuance and the sensitivities. And Seth mentioned everything was going so well for Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, for Rabbi Jacob Joseph. So Abe Kahn was the one who I think wrote a forward article in his third sermon on the Lower East Side. And he noticed that he spoke a different dialect of Yiddish than they were used to. His handkerchief came out in a non-American fashion out of his pant pocket. He didn't look the part for an Americanized brand of Orthodox Judaism.
Well, think of Salanter in the 19th century when he saw modernity was coming and the East European Jewish community was not able to respond. The big problem, he said, was it has become a religion of habit, conformist practice, and behavior. It doesn't have the inner content or the inner awareness or inner internalized values. I think that's what you're seeing here, that Orthodoxy, for the vast majority of its observant Jews in this country, at that point at least, was simply what's familiar, what's the habit, what's the practice, rather than substantive, and therefore it could not stand up when the substance was challenged, or when the conformity disappeared. When you conformed in an Eastern shtetl, you of course conformed as an Orthodox Jew. If you conformed in New York City, in an immigrant community, it was vastly different, and that's where the bleeding and that's where the losses came in.
Right, something that the social scientist and theorist Peter Berger had presumed in the heretical imperative in the late 19th century, which apparently was being passed along in the back rows of Rabbi Soloveitchik's lecture, according to some observers and testimonies at the time, where he suggested that with the wake of modernity, with the breaking down of all types of different ghettos, of different walls, tradition-bound faiths don't really stand a chance. And I think it's on page 18 or page 19. where he indicates that one of the communities that's faring the best is Orthodox Judaism, but even they are going to have to bow to the realization of certain modern technologies, mobilities, and socializations, which you can't upkeep the, I think what you're saying is the integrity of the substance of that faith. And most tradition-bound faiths certainly fell, they had to shift, but they had to reorient themselves in that way. Certain clerical legislation on intermarriage, who can be churched and who can't be. The index of the acceptable books in the Catholic canon was greatly diminished and then done away altogether. In this period, you saw less and less descriptions of heresy hunting in the press in the 70s and 80s, with the exception of certainly some fundamentalists, but very often, who was a heretic? Somebody who didn't agree with your politics. It was adjacent to American politics. One of the interesting exceptions, the counterexample to all of this, is Orthodox Judaism in the, we're going to focus on the 80s, but certainly begins in the 1970s, and it comes in a variety of spaces. So on the right, you have a letter to the editor. Rabbi Schneider Cutler has recently passed away in the late 1970s, and there's a reminder of a very impassioned Agudas Yisrael discourse keynote that he gave, excoriating American materialism, asking his followers to tone down their lavish weddings, to make sure that they don't absorb all that is offered in consumer culture at the time. But it comes in all different types of spaces. So for example, on the left, and I'm gonna blow it up so we can all see it, is a footnote in the Medrash Says, a very important publication which reaches not just the elite, but anybody who's interested in the Parshat HaShavua of all different Orthodox, and I imagine non-Orthodox types. And this is just one of many examples that comes out. I've read through all 5 volumes. This mitzvah includes the acquisition of tefillin, mezuzahs, and other religious articles that were written with the greatest meticulousness and halachic perfection. The Medrash indicates that a Jew should direct the innate aesthetic appreciation common to all mankind towards the acquisition of beautiful objects of Kedusha rather than exert efforts toward the acquisition of objects of ephemeral value, such as elegant furniture or clothing. This doesn't appear, to my knowledge, in any other Medrash collection before the 1980s. The Torah concept of, not to say that the Noda B'Yehuda long before this attacked materialism, but not quite like this. The Torah concept of striving for beauty and perfection in the fulfillment of mitzvahs requires self-education. It stands in stark contrast to the sad reality, and one has to account for inflation over here, of the $20,000 bar mitzvah, smorgasbord orchestra, and all. You can't really do that for $20K any longer, for which the cheapest pair of tefillin were purchased. Likewise, people spend great sums on furnishing a home with only first quality articles and the very best interior, yet the same home is provided with the cheapest of mezuzah. So American culture is under assault in certain Orthodox quarters. And here's an example of how, not quite using the language of heresy, although it comes pretty darn close, that here's something that is not far afield from traditional formulations of heresy, but the language very clear, the admonishment and the harshness of it clearly shows that there is an awareness that Orthodox Judaism needs to create firmer lines, and one of them is to combat the 1980s, that culture of materialism. Next slide, or should any comment?
Let's move on just to some of the other examples.
Sure. Another is Das Torah, a really freighted term. But in the right image, you have I think it originally appeared in Yiddish, but Rabbi Moshe Scherer offers in his collection, and this is an article published in the 1980s, so the longtime head of the Agudas Yisrael, formulates that Das Torah in the third paragraph is a statement of Emunah itself. That not just, so Das Torah exists, Jacob Katz long ago dated the emergence of Das Torah to the 1870s. But there was a change in the language over Das Torah in this period, where it's not just a smart decision to follow the rabbinic elite, to suggest that they have a higher level of wisdom, that they're in touch with the level of insight that others do not, but the language that if you do not follow Das Torah, and we can marshal other texts as well to suggest this in addition, is that not following, not only is it a poor decision, not only is it unwise, but it's actually a violation of Emunah, of belief.
So here you have a good example, a really good example. I don't know if you're going to make the text bigger, but in the 40s and the 50s and even in the 60s, what we would call generally the ultra-Orthodox, but that which was going on basically across the board, was considered fine. And the fact that just about every yeshiva student went to college certainly didn't bother anybody. And it wasn't only in yeshiva university, but it was everywhere. All of a sudden, starting in the 70s and 80s, again, you have this attack on consumerism, but even things that were normative in America as Orthodoxy starts forming its identity and becoming stronger, and that's the key word I want to use, because I believe it's really about power in the end. As Orthodoxy starts feeling its power, and it's an irony, as Rabbi Greenberg said a minute ago, Orthodoxy has basically been bled, right? In the 30s, in 1930, 71% of American Jewry identifies as Orthodoxy. By 1971, it's less than 30%. And yet, in response to that power, now, the same Orthodox rabbis who should be clamoring for Jews are saying all those Jews who go to college, oh, they're heretics as well. There's a certain consolidation here that I think is very, very important.
Right. So in other words, it's not that Orthodoxy has risen in numbers. They're between 8 and 10% of the American Jewish population. But these rabbis, these leaders are doubling down that they have a very committed 8 to 10%.
Right. And in a minute, when we get to the Yitz story, I think you're going to see that, in its most blatant form, and that's going to be the real contrast to.
I would suggest again that we're using the term Orthodoxy sort of as a standard term, but you're really describing Haredi Orthodoxy, and of course Shishera and so on. And in other words, it's true that the Orthodox as a group and modern Orthodox specifically were declining in numbers, but the Haredim in fact were growing, starting with the coming to America in the 50s and 60s, in the 50s, and then growing population throughout the 60s and 70s. So I think you're talking about actually they did grow. They also built institutionally and building up their strength that way. And it's their psychology, it's their culture, and in fact, it's their style, because the essence of Haredism was the point that you didn't debate or listen or criticize modernity. Frankly, I think it's because if you did, you'd lose, but rather you simply shut out the contradictory voices. So I think that's what you're hearing and that's what you're seeing here. And I agree, it grows out of a sense of growing power, but it's the power of this group, which came over from Europe, survived as quite broken, and then gradually built up both in numbers and financial and institutional strength.
I remember, Yitz, that once we were sitting at your Shabbos table and Reuven Kimmelman made the observation, he asked me what was the difference, what did I think the difference was between YU in the 60s and YU in the 80s? And I said some of the American-born rabbis, etc. And he said, no, the most popular lecturer in YU in the 60s was Yitz Greenberg, and by the 1980s, he wouldn't be allowed to teach there. So I'm not sure it's only in the Orthodox, in the what you call the Haredi, from Torah Vadas to Lakewood, or even the Yulas, but I think it's even in Yeshiva University, you have this growing sense that we need to, keep people out who aren't thinking.
Except that what you're describing is that Yeshiva University, or at least in its Rosh Yeshivas and REITs, was taken over by Haredi, or what I call Haredi Light. That is to say, they had college education, many of them at YU itself, but they were culturally and religious values very much yeshivish and Haredi. And of course, you're right about my not being allowed to teach there by the 80s, but of course it was a reflection, again, of the Rosh Yeshiva and their power, which again in Haredi wins by exclusion.
I don't believe you can say that the rabbis in the 80s that were there, even the Parnases or the Braunspiegels, and we'll talk about them in a couple of minutes, were any more Haredi than Rav David Lifshitz, who was there in the 60s, right? Who was clearly just the European, or no, they were equally Haredi in that sense. It's just that in the 80s they had power, and in the 60s they didn't.
In the yeshiva world, I prefer Haredi. I understand. I think everybody understands the terminology that we're using. The Haredi, I almost see that Haredi ought to be used more for Israel and the yeshiva world for America. But either way, we understand. So I just want to make sure that we're using these terms interchangeably. But the yeshiva world is not stagnant in this time. So here on the left side, and I blowed it up for you, is a woman who is responding in the Jewish Observer to allegations that Beis Yaakov graduates go to college. And here's a no, we do not. Maybe in a previous time. I also object to the implication that Beis Yaakov is gearing girls for a college education. To the contrary, college is discouraged, both openly and implicitly. Now, there is no such thing as the Beis Yaakov movement. Each school operates on its own. But the yeshiva world, save for Rav Aaron Kotler, who delivers an impassioned sermon in his famous Macha for the Brisker Rav in the 50s, the yeshiva world is by and large attending college in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's only until this period, and truth is, higher education and the culture on campus. Actually, one of the first people to point out the challenges for Jews on campus was Yitz Greenberg in an article in Judaism in the 1960s. So in that case, you are in tandem with this movement. But so college education is changing, and everything is really moving. Everything is quite volatile in post-war American culture. The yeshiva world, though, was tolerant, I wouldn't say embracing, but tolerant of certain forms, particularly night school at Brooklyn College, which we know was heavily enrolled with students, concurrent students of Chaim Berlin and Torah Das. Moving forward in the 1980s, college was anathema in certain yeshivish circles, which again speaks to what we're calling borderlines and patrolling of certain heresies in this period. And it is moving, and we'll into what we would call loosely a modern Orthodox Judaism. And here we don't unfortunately have the speech itself, and he should live and be well, is of course pictured is Rabbi Norman Lamb. But we have an article from the Jewish Week in which he addresses the Rabbinical Council of America in 1979, and you see they're slightly bolded. He says, the pressure for a monolithic Orthodox community is greater than ever, and it is not healthy. In the second paragraph, Rabbi Lamb said he hesitated to engage in a recitation of the instances of bigotry and shallow-mindedness that afflict us. Little self-contained clumps of self-righteous super piety come into being. He had a certain way with language, each specializing in condemning and attacking some phantasmagoric heretic. And here we see the language of heresy. Those who celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, those who do not eat glutton meat, and certainly those who take anything but a grudging attitude to higher secular education. So Rabbi Lamb is speaking to the rabbinical flagship of modern Orthodoxy. He would eventually change the term to centrist Orthodoxy in the mid-1980s. He wrote a programmatic article in Tradition in 1986. But at the time, he's speaking to modern Orthodoxy, and he is warning about the cultivation of a new taxonomy around heresy that is increasingly creating what he describes as an unhealthy monolithic culture within Orthodoxy. And here, Rabbi Lamb is addressing specifically the modern Orthodox enclave.
This was a phenomenon that began in the late 70s, but really carries, like I said, until the 80s, and particularly, I think, reaches its crescendo to some extent in the Yitz episode that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. It manifests itself, and Yitz will address a little later Rabbi Lamb's role in that whole story, or maybe lack of role in that whole story. I'll just give another example of where it manifests itself as well, something that was very familiar to me in my home, when the Greenberg home as well, which was the women's tefillah movement. In the 70s already, the women's tefillah movement started. By the time it gets to the 80s, it's already become a little more institutionalized, and there's already a couple of places. And then 5 Rashi Yeshiva from YU write a tshuva explaining, which wasn't really a tshuva, they really initiated it. It was really initiated by Louis Bernstein, and Zev has written about this pretty extensively. But they write all sorts of reasons why it's prohibited for women to join in prayer groups. I remember in 1986 sitting in class with Rav Lichtenstein just after the tshuva came out, and someone asked him about the tshuva, and he said, look, the truth is that the 5 reasons they give there in the tshuva don't really stand water. They don't really stand halachic water. He wasn't taking a position whether it's positive or negative, but he said from a halachic perspective, you can't really look at this in any substantive way. On the other hand, one of the rabbis who wrote the tshuva, which was Rabbi Braunspiegel from Yeshiva University, writes a follow-up to the tshuva where he explains each of the 5 answers. And in the 5th answer, and I'm holding the text in front of me, we don't have it in the slides here, but he says, as far as the 5th issue, which is the Rabbi Soloveitchik, his claim that Rabbi Soloveitchik was against the women's tefillah movement, he says, he quotes Rabbi Soloveitchik disagreed with these things, and look at Rav Moshe Feinstein's tshuva as well, not about women's tefillah, that he reads, and I'm just quoting 5 or 6 words here, right? The dangers in forfeiting to the women's liberation movement, v'havi be'einav kikfira. So even something which is halachic completely, the women's tefillah movement, which again, you can make up all sorts of halachic things if you want, which might, yes, it might not, pass muster in the halachic discourse, becomes absolute kfira by 1986.
And that's really important. That I think is, when you're seizing on that, that's really, really instructive and really helpful. Is that is the language isn't to say that it's halach. There's a difference between saying something is halachically right or halachically wrong. The designation of kfira slides the conversation into something altogether different. Right? You're not saying mutter or asur. Kfira is something different.
Right. I would even say, and I wonder out loud here, the extent to which this was going to, pave the way for Rabbi Greenberg, what they were going to do to you. In other words, here they already thought they were doing it to Blue, even though Blue really wasn't involved at this point. But by just dismissing the whole thing without any real halachic substance to it, and just saying, well, we don't like that, so it must be heresy, right? That enables them to come along and find all sorts of other things that are clearly heresy, even though they have no halachic basis whatsoever.
I think you're right, but I think you're both illustrating another reality. Zev, you brought it up before by mentioning Berger. The point is that even though it's based on a psychology, there's no choice and you exclude the other choices, the reality is they're exposed to choice. They're exposed to the various movements, to the liberation, et cetera, et cetera. This is very threatening and very disturbing. So again, the answer, you can't go on simply being a conformist, practical behaviorist. You have to develop a more aggressive affirmation principle, et cetera, to justify it. It's like Orthodoxy itself, which Yaakov Katz at great length pointed out, is not traditional Judaism. It's traditional Judaism when it's been stressed by the challenge of modernity, and it responds by becoming both aggressive and more closed. And of course, the Chassam Sofer's answer, Chodesh Osam and Torah, things that were permitted, things that were neutral, things that were considered quite acceptable and standard, saying tefillah in the language of the country, such as Kaddish, suddenly become usher. And anything Chodesh, and that's where your point comes in Seth, anything Chodesh, including uppity women or any other variation of change, you not only oppose this, you make this you draw the line. This is simply unacceptable and awesome in our Torah.
Where I would part ways, who am I, but to part ways with Yaakov, with Jacob Katz, if you take a look in the third paragraph, it's hard to tell. The white bold doesn't come off as easily. But Rabbi Lamb uses the word authentic. I'm thinking about the women's tefillah group. So the person who wrote the question, who petitioned the 5 YU Rosh Yeshiva, was the president of the RCA, Rabbi Louis Bernstein. And in debating, it was Rabbi Hout, Rivka Hout's husband, in the pages of the Jewish press. He has something startling, probably to our ears, but the time made sense. The position was, well, how can you be in favor of women's Talmud and opposed to women's prayer group? Now, in some sense, it's apples and oranges. But he writes something to the effect of, supporting women's education, yes. Supporting women's Talmud, certainly. Women's tefillah, certainly not. What the objectors to Bernstein is that everything is becoming very freighted, very clumsy, very messy. In different spheres, we're moving in a certain direction. In other spheres, we're moving in an opposite direction. And Bernstein's response is that it's not linear. It's not like what Jacob Katz suggested, that orthodoxy has to be positioned linearly between the poles of tradition and modernity. But it's actually three-dimensional. And so at the same moment in the 1980s, when ERA, for example, so certain professional and political equalities for both men and women in America, is being voted down by statewide ratification at this moment, and women's and feminism is at something of a nadir in the 1980s. We're talking about Reagan's United States of America. So in that space, women's tefillah has no room to gain legs. But in other spaces, in the same period, it certainly does. So there's this unevenness, and that's when and this is my maybe too wordy seizing on this phrase authentic. How modernity is mediating religious and cultural forces that in certain spaces, economic, political, social, each one has its own space and each one has its own sweet spot of authenticity. The 1980s was not the moment for women's prayer. In the 1970s, it went on unscathed.
So I think we're going to see that a little more as we go through, and I think we should try to move to Yitz's issue to talk about the pluralism issue.
Yes, and that's really what I was getting to, is exactly right. Pluralism becomes it goes into the crosshairs of heresy. Pluralism itself becomes a type of heresy. And so here you have two articles, well-known. One is when Gary Rosenbaum was the editor of the Baltimore Jewish Times, off-quoted. And then later on, modern Orthodox rabbis claim assault from RCA right wing, and you see the individuals there. Pluralism, though, isn't the portal of entry, and this gets to, this does, I think, gravitate towards questions of pluralism, but it also is language. So you have three sources here. The first is a letter from the executive of the Orthodox Union, Rabbi Pinchas Stolper, on the left side, petitioning Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik, then of the Brisk Yeshiva and soon to be returning to Yeshiva University, asking him to respond to Yitz Greenberg's really theology, I think is not too strong a word, theology of the failed Messiah. And apparently we don't have the information, but Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik demurs and Hillel Goldberg, and you see so much of the 1960s is moving into the 1980s and so many of the personalities. But maybe, so this is where I stop talking and I allow Yitz Greenberg to maybe offer some comments on this beginning of the episode.
Can I back up for a minute? I will. I'll
Please.
give you a quick answer. But the backup was about, in reflecting back on the whole episode, but what preceded it, one of my conclusions, which I hadn't seen until I reflected on it in the last decade, I had not seen it at the time, is that the 60s had a very powerful impact on everybody, including in the Orthodox community. And of course, and I would say at first it was very attractive and very dynamic, and perhaps the best expression of it, bluntly, is the Soviet Jewry movement. Because the 60s message was, don't stand there, don't take it, fight, go out, take your power, take your opportunity, assert yourself, liberate yourself, etc. In the younger Orthodox movement particularly, that took the form of getting engaged with the Soviet Jewry movement. And you may recall that the Rosh Yeshiva, then the traditionalists, including Rabbi Soloveitchik, although he tried to straddle a little bit, came out against this because this is activism. And of course, the whole tradition in Europe, and you don't rock the boat, and so you don't get the Tsar angry, and you don't get the government angry. So what happened there was, in effect, they defied the YU graduates, including the young rabbis, whether they be Avi Weiss or Shlomo Riskin or Yitz Greenberg for that matter, in effect said, no, we're going to go ahead and take this political action, and because that was the tone of the 60s. Now, that went in a lot of places, and I want to point out to you that the women tefillah is a reflection of the women's liberation. It is. It's not, it took that form, but clearly that it's influenced by that idea. So the answer was a lot of Orthodox Jews were attracted and influenced by it. Now, it's also true that the more traditional and the yeshivish and the Haredi elements were disturbed and threatened by this, and hence they're lashing out even at tefillah, which when you think about it is certainly not a very very, very heretical, asking to daven or to have women's expression in davening isn't exactly a very profoundly heretical feeling or idea. Now to come back to your question, remind me your question again about right now about the 80s, the transition. What was the question, Zev?
Well, I wanted this has the language and certainly when we talk about pluralism, it comes with the different players, different stakeholders in pluralism. I think very often I think as we'll see, your challengers were more focused on Orthodoxy's relationship to other movements within American Judaism, but here the initial foray was into the cultivation of a discourse that was ecumenical.
So let me come back to that. I think that's a good point. I'll say a word about that. Now, my point about the 60s was that it had a positive attraction to many Orthodox Jews, and the more attractive it became more threatening to the more traditional side of the community. And now I had the following. I have to say this is, I think, part of what was going on. As the 60s unfolded, it became more and more radical. And many modern Orthodox rabbis who initially were sympathetic and engaged became increasingly disturbed and threatened. Again, it's one thing to say about women becoming more assertive, and that's part of what tefillah is about, or women learning more. But suddenly they were hearing or reading the papers that, sexual liberation, freedom and sexual liberation and things of that sort. So the freedom, or students questioning or students intellectually challenging the rabbis, it's one thing when it starts and it may be even treated as it shows that they're getting engaged. But as the questions became more biting and more threatening, there was this counter-reaction. So I'd say that in my mind is what started to happen in the RCA and at YU, that people who were initially in the spirit and accepted the idea of a synthesis and education, secular education, became increasingly threatened by what they felt was the extreme or the out of control direction in which it went. Now I come back to myself. The truth is I had a very different path, although it was not in public, and it was not to some extent fully understood either by maybe not by me, but certainly not by the YU and the Orthodox community. In '61, I spent a year in Israel, and that was a religiously and personal turning point, because I went there as what I was, which was a highly satisfied, a highly complacent, highly fulfilled modern Orthodox Jew, and loved every part of it, felt its adequacy and its superiority in every way. I stumbled into the Shoah, and it was a devastating, overwhelming year personally. And, I simply could not reconcile what was happening, what happened in the Holocaust. Obviously, I was discovering it, I just found it out. And I spent the year totally immersed in it. I could not justify my own religious positions. They were all shaken and profoundly challenged. And on top of that, of course, the Haredi, or traditional answer that B'nai Chatainu just revolted me, and of course, totally outrageous and wrong. So it starts with that. And then in trying to put my act together and trying to sort of come to grips with it, I sort of came to conclusion, number one, that Orthodoxy doesn't have all the answers. It has serious problems to address. It doesn't have all the answers. Now, not that the others had either, but
yeah. When you say Orthodoxy, you don't. I assume you don't mean Orthodox. You don't mean traditional Jewish sources. You mean the social construct of the Orthodox community.
Well, I mean the community, its religious and rabbinic leadership, and its general lifestyle. It was not, in my judgment, in coming to grips with this, nor did it begin to respond to the answers or try to give answers that were directions even that I found tolerable. I mean, to give me an answer, that this was a punishment and that it's the Zionist fault or it's the Reform Jews' fault, it struck me as adding insult to injury. So that was number one. And number two is I felt the Shoah, to me, it turned into what I have argued for 50 years since, what I call an orienting event, an event that guides a religion and our understanding, it's a kind of a revelation, as the Churban was. And of course, as at the very same time, to me, the creation of Israel, the emergence of Israel was. And what's the point of the Shoah? It was not directed at Orthodox Jews. It was directed at all Jews. All Jews had the same fate. And for that matter, my reaction was, and anybody who chose to be a Jew and remain a Jew after this is heroic and is gutsy. And there are times, my father once said to me when I was being frum at home, who should be more ashamed of themselves for their behavior, God or the Jewish people? So from my point of view, in effect, I became a pluralist before I realized what was happening. I didn't translate that into religious pluralism until 4 or 5 years later, when David Hartman and I brought together a group of rabbis in Canada to study together. And it turned out that the conservative and reform rabbis were extraordinarily dynamic and religiously powerful people. And suddenly I realized that my unease, my feeling that Orthodoxy was not a full and sufficient answer, and that the other groups had important and legitimate role in Jewish religion and in Jewish community, I suddenly realized it's more than that. In fact, I had to admit that these people were reflecting what I considered to be a genuine, valid, if mistaken and if made serious errors that I disagreed with, didn't matter. They were valid, legitimate participants in religious life. They were doing their best to keep Jews Jewish and to develop a religion that was credible in these circumstances and so on. So in effect, as I said, in fact, looking back, the real signal here was the commentator article and the exchange with Aaron Lichtenstein. Aaron Lichtenstein was a participant, by the way, in the group, and that's another whole conversation in Canada. But to come back to the main point, I was basically, talk about boundaries, measuring my credibility and my personal belief by what this group, which was a cross-denominational group, believed and respected. And of course, people like Emil Fackenheim in the group became deeply, as I was, deeply immersed in theology post-Shoah and so on. So in effect, what I began to think, and my criticism of Orthodoxy, it was because I was now measuring it by a much broader parameter than the internal community. And what came out in that commentator article, of course, was many criticisms I felt of where Orthodoxy had not responded and where Orthodoxy was not coming out of the ghetto and dealing with the contemporary issues. But I realized in retrospect that it was so far off because at that very moment, the other force, the swing to the right, the withdrawal from these issues, the closing of ranks, was happening at YU. So there was there were two different trends. They crossed each other and it caused a little bit of a blow up right then and there. Of course, what happened was, and of course, again, what happened was on my side, the pluralism was already so deeply entrenched, and I didn't see any other credible, that I kept going, and therefore in the next decade created the cloud to express and to make available a pluralist exploration, search for meaning. What I'm saying is that I think there were two different trends, and in fact I was continuing to move toward Klal Yisrael and toward defining, not only as a pluralist, but defining my own parameters of community and of acceptable behavior and of border limits by what the broader Jewish community was doing and thinking and believing, whereas YU and the modern Orthodoxy, which was beginning to reset itself as centrist, and that's what Norman did, was closing ranks and closing borders and starting to shut out these alternatives. So I left YU in 72 when I left Riverdale Jewish Center to go to academia and to Jewish studies, in part because I wanted to explore the Holocaust in Israel and felt even a shul, which I loved, and a religious Orthodox community with a vital day school and so on. But I felt it couldn't come to grips with the challenge of making Shoah and Israel the religious central to Jewish religion, including to Orthodoxy.
So I have a question.
That's where.
So your reflections. What's striking about it, number one, is John Wucher in Sacred Survive, the late John Wucher, I believe has an entire section of a chapter towards your Holocaust work, Holocaust
Right.
theology. And in the preceding chapter, he describes the relationship between America, Holocaust, and the emergence of the State of Israel as a foundational story, narrative, or myth for American Jews. And you're one of the people who are cultivating that language for so many American Jews. But at the same time, and if you take a look, and I know it's small, but if you look at the Jewish Action article, the sub-headline is the message authentic?
Right.
And it occurs to me, and the issue, of course, with failed Messiah is extended to pluralism, not just within Judaism, but within towards Christianity as well. And I want to make sure that we address that.
That's correct.
But my question is, when he says, is the message authentic? It seems to me it's a question of formulation of language in many respects. And even when the Rabbi and Lichtenstein conversation, which obviously has been written down so much, and much of this actually, I should say, is born out of conversations in the dissertation that Josh Fagelson wrote on you. And hopefully the book will be available sometime soon. Is much of as we move through these slides, how much of the issue is language and formulation? Because it's provocative. Failed Messiah is a provocative term.
No kidding. The point is, again, in response to the Shoah and that whole religious, personal, transformation, if you will, or whatever, that whole experience expressed itself. Blue and I both decided after 61 that we were going to join the Jewish-Christian dialogue. And again, the reason very bluntly was we saw Christianity as the primary source of anti-Semitism in the Western culture, which Hitler exploited, so obviously in a much more demonic and total vicious way, but that Christianity was such a source and was continuing to be a source. So we joined the dialogue, as I say, in all honesty, not in a very dialogic mood, but in the mood of stop the anti-Semitism, change, repent for your sins and stop this hatred and supersessionism and so on. Now, that happened, again, I think to me this is much more profoundly theological than it sounds. But in doing this and in dialogue with Christians, I met these Christians who it turned out, first of all, most of them were way ahead of me in realizing Christianity's faults and in this area particularly, its guilt. They were way ahead of me. They had an amazing integrity and honesty of self-criticism. They had profound moral concern, not only for Jews, and they felt that we had to make up for the Jews, what we'd done to them, but for the world. In short, bluntly, I was bowled over by the religious and ethical power and genuineness and authenticity of these people. And what happened to me was, I joke about it, I say I came to criticize and I stayed to praise. I discovered this must be some incredible religion if it can inspire people of that caliber. So the truth is, you're right. So in the process of pluralism, in a way, my pluralism toward Christianity came ahead of my pluralism to Judaism. In other words, because of the time, it took me a few years more before I met non-Orthodox Jews who enabled me to see that again, that there was a living vitality on the other side that I respected and wanted to treat as a genuine participant or partner in Jewish tradition. So yes, it started first. Now again, I had a serious, it's not finished now. It's been 50, 60 years exploration. I felt Judaism has to rethink its attitude toward Christianity. I came to believe that Hashem wanted Christianity. It was not just some warped anti-Jewish mistaken group of Jews who messed it up. That in some way, Hashem wanted the Brit of Sinai, which was offered to the Jewish people and accepted, to be made available in some other form to the rest of the world. And that's what Christianity was about, that it distorted it, that it attacked the Jews, that it bothered me a lot, but I could be corrected. But at the heart of it was, so the pluralism was there first. The article that you're talking about Jesus failed Messiah, was part of an exploration of trying to find a new language, a Jewish language, that could simultaneously disagree with Christianity and uphold the Jewish standard, and at the same time would affirm and recognize the strong and the good parts of it. So again, that's when I came up with this idea that Jesus was not a false Messiah. The false Messiah would be Shabsai Tzvi. He teaches you sin, his holiness. He teaches you, sexual license is really a form of worship. But a failed Messiah is someone who has good teaching, good values, reaches out and influences the world positively, but doesn't in fact fulfill the Messiah's role, that is to say, redeem the whole world. Now, and if I put in a footnote, and I always enjoyed that footnote, as a fact, because by the 1990s, Lubavitcher Rebbe Zatzal was already being touted as the Messiah, and of course my reaction wasn't confirmed by his death, but you could see that before he died. He was not a false Messiah, even though I think he was not the Messiah. I felt the correct category of him is a failed Messiah, namely, he did tremendous good. I mean, I think he was we should recognize his greatness and that people thought they could take him to be the Messiah as a sign of how much he accomplished. And on the other hand, he failed. He didn't meet the test or carry out. So I come back, that language and that failed Messiah was an attempt, yes, to articulate a new Jewish language. And part of the fact was the ignorance or the ill will, mostly ignorance, but some ill will. Goldberg basically claims that I believe Jesus is the Messiah. The fact that I said he's a failed Messiah, he acts as if that's an irrelevant word, but of course, it's just the opposite of what he's implying. So that was part of the ill will, but I'm sure in Rabbi Aaron Soloveitch's case, it's more theological in unfamiliarity or ignorance. It basically thinks that or would seem to have thought that I really am I believe in Jesus. So so this is what triggered off, and it's one of the fascinating background of the whole trial too, because on the one hand, it's clearly this that triggered off the attempt to focus zero enemy and say he is a heretic. It also turned out to be, paradoxically enough, the trial itself, however, when they came to the trial, they kind of backed away. And in retrospect, I think it's because they thought that if it becomes a trial of my views on Christianity, there will be anti-Semitism and pogroms and God knows what else, because people will say Yitz Greenberg is being persecuted because he's being nice to Christians or because he respects Christianity. So they kind of, it was a background. It was clearly very disturbing and very driving people. But on the other hand, the trial itself was 90% focused in on pluralism and the fact that Klal was offering non-Orthodox services. So this is the transition, I would say. This is probably what made me the target, or made me the appealing target, because it's a pretty severe thing, and it shook people who didn't know any better. I mean, I remember when I went to work with Michael Steinhardt during the year, he told me he was a good friend of Ira Rennett's. And he said to me, Rennett said to him, how can you work with Yitz Greenberg? This man believes in Jesus, Christ.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Now, while Yitz is coming on, so I'll just note that Yitz mentioned before the issue of Rabbi Lamb kind of playing an important role in ceding territory in the tradition article. The trial really begins a little earlier. One of the things Zev and I discovered in our research is, I don't know if you can make it bigger, but the article on the left, you can see on the article on the right, is called Klal Shiatzami Not Klal. And that
is Rabbi Moshe's share of the Aguda again, right?
Right. Yitz, I don't know if you can hear us now, but on the left-hand side.
I can hear you. You can't see me, but I can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
That's what some people argued about you in the 80s as well. Yes, so in the article on the left is an article by Rabbi Schechter from Yeshiva University, where in a halachic article buried in Ora Mizrach about family purity, if you will, Rabbi Schechter goes after Rabbi Greenberg.
Not a Tarat HaMishpacha, but Zera Yisrael.
Yuchsin, I don't know how to say that in English, but dynasties and Jewish, who is the Jew? Let's call it that. He goes after Rabbi Greenberg full force, by name, everything except for the word Greenberg. And he says people who are trying to speak for the Klal and they only speak for the Prat. And he really attacks Klal and Rabbi Greenberg very forcefully. One of the things we discovered in our research is that when this article is republished a number of years later, Rabbi Schechter's anthology of articles, all the sections about Rabbi Greenberg are censored out. But originally, the trial really starts not from the Rabbi Lambs or from the Rabbinical Council of America. It really starts from the halachic, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University, who are attacking Rabbi Greenberg. And then it continues, or quickly moves, to the space of the Rabbinical Council of America and the Vada Kavod. So I think if we look at some of those sources for a minute.
Right. Now, I'll just only add is what's fascinating, again, both with Rabbi Sher and Rabbi Schechter, much of their opposition it doesn't reach to the point of theological, although I'm sure they would have had theological issues as well to take on. But it's also about language. It's about discourse. It's about who are your sources. And what's interesting, just to sort of zoom out for a moment, is that while so many of American religious leaders are engaging in dialogue and theology and cooperative theology, the Orthodox are not. They're interested in brandishing and furnishing lines. And so this type of language is just not happening in this very, very small set, but it certainly is happening in other sectors of American religion.
The other thing I want to point out, just for the listeners, is that when Zev and I showed this article of Rabbi Schechter's to Yitz, sort of called what we call the beginning of the trial, Yitz was unaware that this article had even come out in the 80s. In other words, when we showed it to him last week, he pointed out, I never even knew such an article existed that I was attacked in.
Right.
In other words, it shows that there was kind of the beginning of the discourse began kind of within the walls of the Beis Medrash, in the very, very confined walls of the Beis Medrash, and then quickly, kind of rolled out of proportion very, very quickly.
Right, so here you have three images. The center is the letter from the Vada Kavod requesting requesting Yitz Greenberg to stand before them without any reason why. And then on flanking it is the same letter, pages 1 and 2, to the president of the RCA, Rabbi Milton Poland, who just passed away about 2 years ago, I believe. And in here, Yitz, you're with us?
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry my picture is not on the screen, but I'm hearing you and I'm seeing you.
Okay, well, you were on the title page, so
I hope you
we
can,
all know
I
it.
hope you can hear. I hope you can hear me at least. I can't see myself. I don't know why.
And so what I'm stunned by, again, is here you have your defense, and you don't know exactly what these charges are, but each one, you begin, I am an Orthodox rabbi. And you offer the explanations of why you were an Orthodox rabbi, and you offer sort of a resume, a highlight reel of your career to this point. What's interesting about this letter, and I think we should move on, but just what's so interesting about this letter is that you speak. It seems to me that you're the conversation. You're two ships passing one another in the night.
No,
you're offering a traditional formulation for your orthodoxy. And the charges against you, pluralism, have nothing to do with the Maimonidean principles of faith.
No, the answer is that the letter says nothing, but in private conversation, direct conversation, they made very clear that this was about the claim that I pay pluralism, namely that I'm offering, Kalal is offering religious services, which recognize and reform rabbis who are teaching, et cetera, and that was so in effect they're saying this is conduct unbecoming an Orthodox rabbi, and I'm in effect violating or forfeiting my standing as an Orthodox rabbi. They made clear that's going to be the charge. So of course I wrote back exactly what I wrote back, that if we're comparing Orthodox records or Orthodox careers or Orthodox accomplishment, I consider myself a pretty good example of an Orthodox rabbi. In fact, again, I have to say, although I was a pluralist, and that's why I started Klal, I always felt that in bringing Klal, or bringing Torah through Klal to the American Jewish community, that I was bringing what I thought was the best of Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy, to the Klal Yisrael. And that was, for example, again, intensive learning, intensive religious experiences, which I picked up because I grew up and was educated in an Orthodox Jewish community. To me, was self-evidently the key to the future of American Jewish community. One of the main themes of my career was very early identified going to have a major challenge of assimilation and intermarriage because of university, but university was because we were exposed to the fullness of American culture, and we didn't have an equivalent high-level culture. So I felt that's part of the reason why I wrote back by defending my Orthodox credentials, is that I felt in Klal itself, my own credibility was at least in part because my message was that everybody, including Orthodox, are in this together. To the extent that it would be established that I'm not an Orthodox Jew and Orthodox rabbi, it would destroy A, the respect for Orthodoxy that I think it was entitled to. B, it would undermine a lot of the claim that I had that using these tactics will give you the richness of life that Orthodox community has. And again, the whole idea of variety and pluralism is undermined if a good chunk of that spectrum is not part of it. So my point of view, I felt the most immediate response was to defend, and I think it was self-evident, the legitimacy of my Orthodox rabbi. Now, it didn't solve the problem of their resentment.
Right.
At the pluralism and non-observant, but you're right. It needed fresh thinking, and right at that point, not only the Orthodox community and the Yeshivish community, but the YU community seems to have been out of fresh thinking, or a willingness to consider fresh thinking.
Yeah. So the next stage, really the first episode of the Vada Kavod kind of disappears. Maybe you want to address for a moment your fabulous letter. I'm not sure if it's up here now. I can't really see it, about the hashkachos.
Right. No, it's right here. So that's in 1987. So the previous letter from the Vada Kavod is in 1987. And now we're fast forwarding, so just so we can see. So the first letter to you is in May 1987. It's
correct.
There's not much in your archives, and I say that all of this comes from your papers that are held in the Widener Library at Harvard University. And here, the next round is in 1989, and Rabbi Zev Siegel writes the pro forma letter. They did not edit it. Dear Rabbi Greenberg, whether they are in violation of the 1954 Accord with the Union of Orthodox Congregations of America. Why? Because of the previous sentence, who have national hashgacha. So there's a language apparently in which people are summoned to the Vada Kavod of the Rabbinical Council of America. Your response, as Seth points out, is, I don't do hashgachas.
No, well, first of all, you have to understand, that's a classic example of incompetence, obviously, the letter on the left side. Zev Siegel, by the way, was uncomfortable with the whole business from start to finish and expressed that to me many times. But what happened, he claimed, later he told me what happened is that he told the secretary to send out a standard letter. Obviously, the answer is no one ever got called out for heresy. The only thing they ever got called up for was hashgachas. So she sent the standard letter, apparently. He claims he didn't notice it. I find it hard to believe, but either way, it was clearly not only incompetent, but didn't say much about the supervision of the process. So I couldn't resist. The truth is, my response was obviously partly tongue-in-cheek, but I couldn't resist it. I have the hashgachas, but the last time I supervised the kitchen was and got in a plug about my turning the Brandeis kitchen kosher. So, I mean, that is, again, I'm glad I hadn't lost my sense of humor to that extent. But of course, he quickly straightened out that it was not, again, he tried his best to tell me we're not calling you in, there's no charges. Of course, none of that was true. But he felt uncomfortable and felt guilty. There were several members of Vada Kavod who knew that this was a departure or betrayal, I'm not sure what the word is, of the kind of modern Orthodox mutual respect and proper procedure that they had grown up with, that I had grown up with. But of course, they were under pressure, and part of the answer again is that and of course, Norman Lamb is part of this picture too. I said before, I think it's one of the tragedies of the history of modern Orthodoxy that has pushed from the right, partly outside and partly inside the RCA, the institutional leadership, which was modern Orthodox, much more moderate and much more, frankly, much closer to my experiences than to the right. Instead of, Lamb made that speech, but he didn't draw the line, and the pressure kept building up. And in the end, I think he basically decided in this case that he will, make some concession or let this process run in the hope it wouldn't get too far, that he would be able to keep it under control. It was a combination of those. Don't forget, you have to keep in mind it's went all the way through. Jonathan Sachs, when he was chief rabbi, in the same way, and again, these are outstanding modern Orthodox leadership, but in fact, they never stood up on this issue. The pressure from the right, they basically gave in, and therefore the policy and the tone setting in the English community was set by the Beis Din, much as at YU, the Rosh Yeshiva took over. And so basically in the end, rather than stand up, and even if they had the choice, when the commentator article blew up, I went to see the Rav, in part because I'd heard that they were trying to get him to denounce me. I went to see him, and I walked in the door, and it's a conversation that I'll never forget, but I walked in the door, he said to me, Greenberg, he said, they're trying to get me to denounce you, but I promise you I never will. And then he went on to say, and the main part of the conversation was that he didn't agree with many of the views that I said in that, but he felt absolutely these are the issues that should be talked about, and what's more, that they're some of the things I said made good sense and had to be incorporated in the understanding, and so on and so forth. So my point is that this is the background, but the institutional leadership, and I guess in the end the Rav too, because he didn't stop it, he never went public. I said to him, if you feel this way, why don't you say publicly? It would be a big help. And then I said to him, another part of the conversation, why don't you give at least shiurim on hashkafa so that students get a real sense of what you stand for and what you really believe. He went into a rage. I'm not sure that's the word, but maybe a rant, maybe like a cage lion. He said, yeah, I can't. He said, I'd like to, I'd love to. He said, but my students won't let me. He said, if I tell them I have another shir, another halacha, another chiluk, you'll love that. Let's hear more. If I tell them I want hashkafa, they don't want to hear. So then he let his students push him into silence hashkafa, into this kind of legalist, pure brisker, intellectual, mathematical, halachic approach, which lacked a lot of the neshama. And he said it to me too. He was quite furious. He sort of said, they lack neshama, they don't understand. He was quite, felt trapped that and the Rav had his incredibly powerful emotional side. He had both sides. I'm not saying the other side is not a true representation of him, but he had this other side, including Kabbalistic and religiously, emotionally profound feelings, which were being pushed aside. And he knew that, but he didn't. He chose not to fight it. Maybe he was emotionally and physically, past that ability, but certainly the institutional leaders made the same mistake. When I say it's a mistake, I mean, obviously it was a mistake, it hurt me, but no, the real mistake is that modern Orthodoxy was devastated by this collapse.
So a couple of historical observations. Number one, by this point, Rabbi Soloveitchik has retired.
Correct.
So he's not on the scene. And number two is that whereas the modern Orthodox leadership have not surrendered to the monthly requests, putting it kindly, of the Jewish observers starting in 1963 onward, and even from the 1956 Rosh Yeshiva Psak Din of 11 Rosh Yeshiva, notably Rabbi Blazer Silver and Rabbi Soloveitchik, do not sign on to it. That itself is a different episode worthy of exploration. Is that by the 1980s, whereas tolerance, pluralism, somewhere in between is something worth fighting for the modern Orthodox establishment, we're talking in a post-patrilineal world. We're talking about the ordination of women, which was anathema in Orthodox circles. In the seminary, it started in 1983, 1984, 1985, were the votes, the decision, and the ordination. And so it's not just there are shifts of the movement, but the perception of the variable, that being pluralism, is changing as well.
I don't think it's changing. The opposition to pluralism was there before, but it becomes much more intense, and it's seen as much more threatening. And it's, the example being, of course, who is a Jew. The fact in Israel they try to push through, a law which would openly deny the legitimacy of the, the non-Orthodox, and so the Federation world and most of the American Jewish community intensively lobbied and went to Israel to oppose it. And again, Klal, I felt on the principle and on the principles. Also came out saying that this is the wrong move. So that was part of the resentment, and that's part of what pluralism became much more, became therefore not just a theological challenge, but a institutional and political. They felt, betrayal. You're supporting the enemy, and I think you're quite right in saying that the patrilineal and those decisions intensified tension and conflict between the movements and justified, but of course, it cuts both ways. It justified the right wing's pressure that the reform is really breaking the unity of Klal Yisrael and is really Orthodox with no limits.
Oh, my point is that it's a powder keg. My point is just as right-wing religion, the moral majority, to use an extreme example in another religious sphere, is gaining strength, so too are certain elements within all American faith communities. And you put all of these variables together, you get a trial.
Possibly, yeah. It's part of it. I want to point out, nevertheless, that it was a two-way street. Just as the patrilineal was used to justify the right push to exclude and so on, you should know, in fact, always, to me, was one of the most haunting aspects of that vote. You know, the reform movement voted down, and the people who came to Klal, of course, the rabbis who came to Klal, reform rabbis, were leaders in the fight against patrilineal because they saw that it was going to polarize and they're going to be much more break the bridges that exist, or likely break the bridges just between Orthodoxy and the rest of the community. They also thought correctly that it will lead to less observance and less to tradition and the part of reform. Anyway, but to me, it was always haunted me in that final vote. It was the two or three, I don't remember now, rabbinic CCAR conferences preceded that resolution. It was voted down. And finally, it was voted through at this particular form. And to me, the most haunting words are Roland Gittleson, who was very influential within the movement, who got up and said, look, he said, I know you're all opposed to this, or those who are opposing this is because you don't want to upset the Orthodox and you feel we shouldn't burn bridges. But bluntly, he said, if you don't pass it, it'll be the same thing. They'll say you're not valid, you're not rabbis, you're not religious, you're not Jewish. He said, so who are you kidding? So what's the point of opposing this thing? Do what's good for reform. These guys are not going to ever legitimate you or respect you or deal with you in any positive way. And that was no question a major factor in the passage of the resolution, that the kind of a feeling, it's not worth it. Who cares about the Orthodox anyway? It's not worth not offending them because they're totally rejecting of us. So it became a two-way, each extreme justifying the other and pushing the other in the opposite direction.
Right, and the manifestation of the pluralism charge was accusations that you participated in non-Orthodox minyanim on Klal retreats.
Correct. Actually, in the actual conversation, it went beyond that. Again, I have to say, well, yeah, the main charge was that an Orthodox rabbi has no right. It wasn't just participation. Klal offered non-Orthodox religious services, reform or whatever, at all its retreats, as it did Orthodox option also, obviously. And as I explained to them, at Klal, yes, we understood the problem, but we're pluralist, we're not relativists, and therefore we had a rule that an Orthodox rabbi runs the Orthodox services, Reform rabbi runs reform services, etc., because they kept saying, if you sponsor and offer these services, what you're really saying as an Orthodox rabbi is that reform is legitimate and reform is acceptable. You're giving them legitimation, and this is something we can't. You're undermining Orthodoxy. Of course, again, I try to say as nicely as I could. I said, you understand, pluralism it's not relativism. It's pluralism, meaning that we're saying is that Reform Judaism and Reform services are a religious, not only affirmative, but a right of Jews who choose that direction, just as we are right and legitimate reform and offering Orthodox services that I personally participate and lead because I'm an Orthodox Jew. They refuse to accept that. Anyway, so now what made the charge worse was they said, well, it's bad enough that you offer these services, but you make it worse because you go and you participate in them, and I do. And in fact, the truth is not just at Klal, and they knew that also. Throughout the country, I had a rule, I think it's in this document you circulated here too. I had a general rule, I teach Torah to anybody who will learn with me or listen to me. And therefore I spent Shabbat and taught in non-Orthodox synagogues around the country as well as at Klal. And again, don't forget, I was a pluralist. I really believe, I still believe, that Reform, Conservative were making an important contribution to Jewish religious life in America. They were reaching Jews that I couldn't reach. They were holding Jews for Judaism that I could not hold. And I think they were part of what I consider the legitimate spectrum of people trying to reconcile modernity and Judaism. Even those, yes, I'm an Orthodox rabbi in part because I disagree with many of the violations of halakha or many of the dropping of halakha that they had exercised.
I can just
they were mistaken, but not illegitimate, I guess what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, so I want to just try to bring this part to a close. The trial basically ends with something remarkable that, according to the RCA, hadn't really ever happened before, which is the letter on the right, just on the previous slide, where Mr. Jesselson intervenes on your behalf, where Rabbi Lamb isn't willing to. Mr. Jesselson basically pushes Rabbi Lamb to do this, and the letter on the left is the RCA responding with incredulity. You know, how could it possibly be that a lay leader is getting involved in RCA business? But in the end, of course, that's what ends, you know, the trial. But it also involves a certain acquiescence on your part, which I think is the next slide.
So here you have the letter from a very influential lay leader, Ludwig Jesselson. Here you have the letter from the RCA. Here you have a letter from the RCA from Rabbi Max Schreier, president of the Rabbinical Council of America. And Seth, your point is in the third paragraph, it is completely unprecedented in the annals of the Rabbinical Council for anyone outside of the members of the Vada Kavod to involve himself in matters before that body. And so, and to a certain extent, it was unprecedented that lay leaders should be involved in rabbinical dealings.
Yes.
Right. The last thing I want to point out is just the response of Rabbi Greenberg at the end, the letter,
right,
which
yeah.
I think is right. This is Yitz's final letter to the RCA explaining what he's willing to do, the so-called settlement, and then Yitz, maybe you'll finish off by telling us some of your thinking about the future or the present. You know,
Okay.
30 years in retrospect. Maybe you give a minute or two about the letter you wrote to end the trial, so to speak, and keep your membership in the RCA.
Let me back up again. Why did they not in fact go through it, or heretically, or expel me, whatever? Why didn't they? The three main reasons were: number one, they were afraid of a PR disaster. Most of them, particularly, would be afraid that the press would cover it, that modern Orthodox rabbis, or the RCA, runs an inquisition, you know, tries to suppress fair conversation, etc. They were afraid it would be a PR disaster for them. The yeshiva world wouldn't care, but they certainly cared about their image in the press. The second reason was Ludwig Jesselson and the lay people. He wasn't the only one, he was the main one. Ludwig Jesselson was the chairman of the board of YU, so we're not talking just a casual person. Now again, it's complicated, but it boils down, he put significant pressure on Norman Lamb to stop this process. But of course, behind that is another, which is hinted at in the letters too. The board, and certainly Jesselson, he was a Klal Yisrael type. First of all, he was also my congregant for many years, and he was a very devoted congregant, and we were very close, and he agreed with 95% of my thinking anyway. And when he gave this charity, he supported UJA should give to Reform and not just to Orthodox day schools, etc. So the answer is they were very unhappy with the Rosh Yeshiva pushing YU more and more to the right. And he told them many times, and of course the problem was, and Lamb kept saying, I'm doing my best, I can't help it. You have to help me too. I can't, I'm trying, but the truth is I'm being outmaneuvered and outpushed. So Ledesson wrote the letter in part because he felt quite indignant about this is another step to Orthodoxy moving, to close the door and to reject the rest of the Jewish people. And he thought that was really wrong religiously. He was a kind of Torah and Derech Eretz education, but more important, as I said, he was intellectually and spiritually very close to my thinking. So the truth is that because of that pressure, mainly, Norman did step in. Now again, Norman's an ambiguous role here. As I said, looking back, I think he let it start because he thought it would push and he would stop at a good place. I think in the end, he himself found it hard to stop and also hadn't maybe expected to get this pushback from Jesselson, and what was behind Jesselson, the realization that the American Jewish community was going to be offended and going to be make Hawaii look very bad and make modern Orthodoxy look very bad. I think the third reason is just to slip my line here, but you only think about it for a second. But the other reason why I think it didn't go through with it is the Christian part of it. It's kind of funny. The Christian was a major force in getting it started. As I said in the conversation, they didn't talk about it. I realized after it, they really became convinced. It's a good example if they were not participating in dialogue. They really were convinced that if it came out that I was slapped down or punished for developing a positive approach to Christianity, that this would unleash anti-Semitism and a pogrom. I mean that quite seriously. And they apparently at the end, so they agreed not to talk about it during the trial for fear that it was going to get out that this was a major part of the trial. And the other part is, they said that they were worried at the end when they came to a punishment or whatever they thought they had to do. Now, I come back to the letter and to Lamb's role. Lamb basically finally did intervene at the point where it was quite clear that if they were not checked, the vote would be, to censure or expel, or I'm not sure exactly how far it would have gone. Lamb basically said to Lydia and to me, he said, look, he said, I'll do my best to stop it. Of course, I'll use all my political cards, but you have to give me something to go with it. I can't go back and say nothing. Now, the main demand they made was that Klal should stop offering non-religious services, non-Orthodox services, and I said, that's out of the question. The second demand they made was that I should stop teaching Torah at non-Orthodox services. And here again, I basically said, I'm nothing doing. I'll teach Torah. It's non-negotiable. So I was to say, well, what could you say that would make them feel that they have some satisfaction or some reduction? Because their main claim, after all, in the end, is that by offering these services and by teaching there, you're really legitimating and saying there's no difference. So the honest answer is they were right. What I mean to say is, even though I personally kept saying, because I saw it within the first hour of conversation, there was no way they were going to accept the pluralist idea. So what I kept stressing was, but I don't do it personally. And so basically I came back to said, Lamb, because I also felt that an expulsion or a censure would be a blow, not just personally, it was obviously uncomfortable, but because I thought it would be a very heavy blow to the credibility of my work and of Klal's. I said because it would really make Orthodoxy look like what most of these people's stereotype was before they came to Klal, and it also make the whole tradition and the whole higher learning, etc., part of a reactionary and un-American and inhuman, shitas. I felt I had a lot to lose also in this matter. So I came back and said, what I'm willing to say is that I won't run these services or attend these services or teach in a systemic way. Now, what does it mean to teach in a systemic way? The honest answer is it was a dishonest, but it was a Morano and a very legitimate, I felt very legitimate understanding. Systemic meant, in my mind, that meant that I would not be the organizer and the perpetrator at every single service, and which meant that but individual services or individual cases, the answer is yes. And by the way, again, it's ironic that they made the demand about Klal, but they gave up the demand in terms of non-Orthodox synagogues, of which I told and openly talked about my participation. So in effect, this was the bone. And as I say, the bone was, in effect, they agreed to accept words that appeared to be a recognition or a concession to their demand that I stop, but in fact, they understood would have very little difference. The only really substantive difference, because I didn't teach at every single Klal non-religious service anyway. I mean, because we had a lot of other faculty and staff. So the only real substantive change was, and I did say that, and I did observe it, is that I wouldn't take kibudim anymore. My general rule was I told the people I don't want to take a kibbut because it's not proper. I'm not a regular participant in davener in the shul. And mostly they didn't. Once in a while, there was a slip up. Someone come to me, I wasn't going to say to him, I'm not going to take this kibbut because I thought that's a way of saying you're not legitimate. I don't believe that. So I said that what I do is I will make it a real effort, to tell them in advance and make sure there's no slip up. And if there's a slip up, I'm willing to say, look, I promised the RCA that I'm not going to take the kibbut anymore. That was the only substantive change. The other was, frankly, a concession that led, that they could say to their right-wing pressure that they had gotten some concession out of me.
Okay. Seth, final words.
I don't have the language of the letter again.
Sorry.
Yeah. And confine my teaching to okay.
Yeah, what I want to say is that if we come down to, 30 years hence, and again, of course, you remained a member of the Rabbinical Council of America, we've seen this episode, come up a couple of times since. Avi Weiss, after Yeshivat Ma'arat, was threatened, and then he quit the RCA. Most recently, Natty Helfgott was disinvited from the leadership of the Rabbinical Council of Bergen County. This issue of trial has not gone away, and yet somehow you, Yitz, feel empowered. As if once upon a time they talked about you as the road not taken. I think more recently you have come to realize that maybe this was the road taken, or it's the road that's beginning to be taken again. And maybe as we finish up, maybe you'll address that for just a minute or two before we have to finish up.
No.
But today, do you feel like people are back on the derech?
No, let me put it this way. At the time, first I must say again, at the time I was literally, the word is disgusted. I sort of felt a lot of these people I had known, I had some friendships with them, and the people in Nevada Coven I'm talking about, and I really felt that they had, first of all, there was not a serious conversation about my ideas, my values, any of these stuff. It was simply, it was a preset, lynching, if you want to say, and I lost a lot of respect for them in that exchange. And also, I felt in general it was demeaning, not just personally, but to Orthodoxy and to the values that I believed in. So the answer, I came out feeling quite disgusted. I also said, and I correctly, that in the end they won, in the sense that it turned out, this is one of the things I learned during the trial, that I had, particularly those years, but the 10 years before, I had spent all my energy and time in Klal Yisrael, in the Federation world, and building the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and these things. And the truth is, I had let friendships and connections in the modern Orthodox world considerably decline. Those who came with me to Klal remained friends, so the truth is, when I came to the trial, everything that's important is not on paper. It's the relationship with the people, on the judges. It's the attitude in the community. I came to the conclusion that they had won the argument, even if they didn't go through with this. They had won the argument, and that de facto, I didn't have a serious connection. In fact, my conclusion from the whole thing was that I'd lost the argument in this generation. And this meaning in my lifetime, which isn't a pleasant feeling, particularly since I come back to the basic thrust of all my work. I really am convinced this is a major historical transformation point, that the Shoah and Israel are religiously central and turning points in Jewish religion, and I felt this has to be incorporated in everybody. Modern Orthodoxy was my natural constituency. I felt they should know the most, and they my resources, my sources, my everything else. This was the group that had been the most tuned in. So I felt it's very sad. It's sad that in your own lifetime, it's not going to have any effect. What changed, and that you're referring to now, but the answer is, again, I had made my mind up 10 or 15 years earlier that given the choice and given my reaction to the Shoah and to Israel, that even if the Haredi claim was true that the Orthodox would survive and nobody else, that I would go with Klal Yisrael because, if you will, in other words, I'm going with the Jewish people, wherever they're going, and I think this alternative is refuge is not an acceptable one to me. The pleasant surprise was 10 years after I gave up, and I felt sad about it. Jofa started, and then Avi came through with Open Orthodoxy, and then YCT and Maharat, and suddenly it dawned upon me that it's not lost in this generation. So let me come to my conclusion here, and this is, I've said this many times. If you believe that the Torah can live without the Jewish people, then modern Orthodoxy will disappear. And this whole Haredization policy has been disastrous. In 1960, modern Orthodoxy was roughly 2/3 of the 20% of the Orthodox Jews of America, 20% of the Jewish community in America. Pew in 2012 showed that Orthodoxy had declined to 10%, but that the modern Orthodox were 1/3 of that 10%. So they went from 15 to 3%. I mean, that's catastrophic. And the truth is that any leadership of any community that goes that way should resign or be fired. But the point was, if you think that Torah can live without Jewish people, then it's not shocking and it can happen. Or if you believe that the Jewish people can live without Torah, which is what 80% or 90% of American Jewry was approaching, then again, modern Orthodoxy can very well disappear from history and life goes on and the Haredi will carry the banner. But if, as I believe, that the Torah cannot live without the Jewish people, and the Jewish people have a Torah, then the answer is it'll have to be reinvented. And I believe that it will be reinvented. It has to be reinvented. I'll go one step further. It won't be called modern Orthodoxy. Eventually, it'll be called postmodern Orthodoxy, meaning it'll do things that modern Orthodoxy in my time didn't do, like needed halachic change, women's dignity, recognizing gays. I mean, go through a whole long list of what I think will be halachically done, will be done by developing the tradition as it should be developed, not in the frozen, fossilized version that the yeshivish world is trying to make it.
But if it happens.
So that's my conclusion. When you say, well, how do I feel now? My answer is, it's still not going to happen in my lifetime, but I believe that I see the beginnings of what to me is inescapable future of the Torah, namely that it will become influential in the culture that the Jewish people is living. But to do that, it is going to have to go through a lot of development, a lot of change, and a lot of the things that I raised. It'll have to become pluralist. It will have to become much more morally respectable, etc. So I wish I could be part of it. I'll do the best I can write and contribute for the record for the future. But I think that is the future of Torah. Because again, the alternative, as I see it, the yeshivish Haredi centrist version, it's the religion of a small group, 5%, 20% in Israel of the Jewish people. It's a religion that cannot be lived by. It's mishpatim lo yichyu b'hem because in every way, it's incapable. Thank God YU is not that way. We have secular studies, so that it's able also, the yeshivish world, of course, denies that. So they can participate in the medicine and economy that's needed for a better world. So for all those reasons, I believe the Torah in the end, if the Rav says this in Halachic Man, the Torah starts with creation. Why? Because it's not just about the Jewish people, not just about mitzvot. It's about the fate and the destiny of the world. And the Torah wants to be a shaper and a major influence in the shape and destiny of the world. So I believe it will invoke enough loyalty and enough recreation and enough discovery and enough rebuilding for it to make a postmodern rebirth possible.
Now, historians make for the worst sort of prophets. You've graduated from historian to theologian a long time.
As you know from Baba Basra, the answer is fools and children make the best prophets.
I meant me, not you. You can forecast, but I'm struck that even as you architected the vision, it was laden with language that would outfit whatever it is. And so much of, whether it's postmodern, modern, centrist, whatever it is, all of the language and its particular moment are all bound up in a language of where are our borders? How far do we extend our olive branches? So much matters. So much is contingent on how we present ourselves and the time and place. And that to me is quite interesting. This was tremendous, and we'll see what happens.
Very
Take care,
much.
everyone.